The Syrian Revolution, from peaceful uprising to devastating conflict. The Syrian Revolution, part of the broader wave of uprisings known as the Arab Spring, began in March 2011 as peaceful protests calling for democratic reforms and greater freedoms under the authoritarian regime of President Bashar al-Assad. Over time, the revolution evolved into a multifaceted conflict involving local, regional, and international actors. Here's an explanation. Background. Bashar al-Assad's regime. Bashar al-Assad took over as president in 2000, following his father, Hafez al-Assad, who ruled for nearly 3 decades. The Assad regime maintained power through repression, corruption, and control over the media and security forces. Social and economic struggles. Many Syrians faced unemployment, poverty, and lack of political freedom, rising inequality, and state neglect, especially in rural areas, created widespread discontent. Arab Spring influence. Inspired by uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, Syrians were emboldened to demand change. The revolution's beginnings. 2011. Peaceful protests. Protests began in Dara after the arrest and torture of teenagers accused of writing anti-regime graffiti. Demonstrators called for reforms, the release of political prisoners, and an end to corruption. Violent crackdown. The Assad regime responded with brutal force, using live ammunition, mass arrests, and torture to suppress dissent. This escalated tensions and turned peaceful protests into an armed uprising. Escalation into civil war. 2012-2014. Militarization of the uprising. Protesters began forming armed groups to defend themselves. The Free Syrian Army (FA) emerged as a loose coalition of rebel fighters opposing the regime. Fragmentation. Over time, the opposition fragmented into multiple groups, including secular, moderate, and Islamist factions. Extremist groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, affiliated with al-Qaeda and later ISIS, exploited the chaos. Humanitarian crisis. By 2012, the conflict had displaced millions of Syrians, internally and externally, creating one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. Regional and international involvement. Assad's allies. Iran provided financial, military, and advisory support. Hezbollah sent fighters to bolster Assad's forces. Russia intervened militarily in 2015, launching airstrikes against opposition groups to secure Assad's position. Opposition support. Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia supported various rebel groups. Western nations provided limited support to moderate factions, but hesitated to intervene directly. Rise of ISIS. ISIS exploited the chaos to establish a caliphate in Syria and Iraq, drawing international military responses, including US-led airstrikes. Key turning points. 2013 chemical attacks. The Assad regime was accused of using chemical weapons against civilians, sparking international outrage. Despite US threats of intervention, a Russian brokered deal led to Assad surrendering some chemical stockpiles. 2015 Russian intervention. Russia's military support was pivotal in turning the tide of the war in favor of Assad. Current situation. Territorial control. Assad's regime has regained control of most of Syria, but significant areas remain under opposition, Kurdish, or Turkish control. Humanitarian impact. Over 13 million Syrians have been displaced, and more than 500,000 are estimated to have died. Ongoing challenges. Reconstruction is hindered by international sanctions and lack of resources. Political reconciliation remains elusive, with Assad refusing meaningful reforms. Why it matters. The Syrian Revolution is a tragic example of how peaceful demands for reform can spiral into devastating conflict when met with violent repression. It highlights the consequences of authoritarianism and sectarian divisions, the role of regional and global powers in exacerbating conflicts, the human cost of war, with generations of Syrians enduring trauma and displacement. The Syrian Revolution began as a peaceful call for democracy, but escalated into a devastating civil war due to violent repression, regional rivalries, and international involvement. Over a decade later, the conflict has left deep scars on Syria, with millions displaced, hundreds of thousands killed, and the country still grappling with instability and humanitarian crises.